I still remember the first day I walked into that office as if it were yesterday, though every detail is sharper now in my memory because of what came after. The lights were bright, almost blinding, bouncing off the polished floors and reflecting in the glass walls that separated teams from one another. Computers hummed, phones rang intermittently, and the smell of fresh coffee drifted through the air like an invisible welcome mat. People moved with a kind of practiced efficiency, their smiles polite, almost rehearsed, like actors on a stage. Some nodded at me as I passed, but the gestures felt hollow. Still, I didn't notice that then. I only noticed what I wanted to see. A place I had fought for, a position I had earned, a moment that felt like the pinnacle of all my struggle. After years of working in offices where I was overlooked, dismissed or undervalued, this felt like recognition. Every internship, every part-time job, every hour I spent learning, hustling, and proving myself finally led here. I believed in hard work, in loyalty, in showing up even when it wasn't convenient, because I had always assumed that effort would be noticed, that dedication would be rewarded. I believed in fairness, and I believed in the system. That belief, as it turned out, would become the foundation for my disbelief. From the first day, I threw myself into the work. I wasn't content with being good. I wanted to excel. Clients began to notice, some sending appreciative notes, others complimenting my responsiveness and attention to detail. I stayed late, often long after the office had emptied, tackling problems that nobody else wanted to touch. I helped colleagues, even those who barely acknowledged my presence, because I thought that's what you did. You supported others, you built a reputation, you demonstrated value. I was meticulous, thorough, and relentless. I believed loyalty was reciprocal, that respect could be earned, that effort mattered. But the reality was far harsher than anything I had imagined. Everything changed in a single moment. One ordinary afternoon, I was called into my manager's office. The request seemed routine, and I walked in smiling, expecting perhaps a note of praise or guidance, maybe even a new responsibility. Instead, I was met with an expression so cold, so unreadable, that it took me a fraction of a second to realize the gravity of what was about to happen. She looked at me and said simply, "We're letting you go." Effective immediately, I froze. The words echoed in my mind, absurd and surreal. Letting me go. No warning, no prior discussion, no indication that my work, dedication, and loyalty had ever been in question. Just gone. My mind raced, trying to process the impossibility. Questions formed but wouldn't leave my throat. I wanted to argue, to plead, to make them see the mistake. But the room felt smaller, colder, more suffocating than it had any right to. The years of effort, sleepless nights, and extra hours seemed to vanish in a single sentence. The disbelief morphed into something hotter, sharper, more dangerous. Anger, raw and unfiltered, coursed through me. The injustice of it all, the absurdity that I had devoted myself so fully only to be discarded without notice, ignited a fire I didn't yet understand but knew I couldn't ignore. I left the office that day with my head held high, because I refused to let them see the storm building inside me. On the surface, I appeared composed, professional, collected, but inside every nerve burned with determination, every thought spinning toward a resolution I could feel forming, even if I didn't yet know the shape it would take. Walking out, I replayed the moments in my mind, the long hours, the extra effort, the small favors I had done that went unnoticed. How could it have meant so little? How could a single call erase years of dedication, relationships, and results? The unfairness wasn't just personal, it was systemic. They believed that people like me could be replaced without consequence, that talent and loyalty were disposable, that the human effort behind results was irrelevant. That assumption, that arrogance, would prove to be their undoing. But I didn't know it fully yet. What I did know was that something inside me had shifted. The sense of injustice hardened into resolve. I realized in that moment that sitting home, crying, or begging to be rehired was beneath me. I refused to be passive, refused to let someone else define my worth. My mind began plotting, not in a rash, chaotic way, but with calculation and precision. Anger was no longer merely emotion. It became strategy, focus, a fuel that demanded action. I began to map the possibilities, thinking about clients, about my own skills, about the gaps the company had overlooked, the weaknesses they had assumed would never matter. Every insult, every dismissal, every slight became a vector of strategy, a point of leverage that I could use to reclaim control. Even as I walked away from the building, the city felt different. The same streets, the same familiar surroundings, now seemed like terrain I could navigate with purpose. The office had attempted to remove me, but they had overlooked one fundamental truth. I was not powerless. The fire inside me was growing, a mixture of anger, disbelief, and clarity. I understood now that the only path forward was to turn this injustice into opportunity, to convert betrayal into advantage, and to show, not through words, but through action, that dismissing someone like me carried consequences. That day, the perfect job I had once dreamed of, bright lights, bustling activity, promises of recognition, was no longer a symbol of achievement. It had become the spark that ignited a plan, the catalyst for a transformation I hadn't anticipated. The moment of dismissal was the moment of awakening. Loyalty, effort, and integrity had been ignored, but that oversight was about to be repaid in full, not with chaos, not with revenge for its own sake, but with precision, patience, and the undeniable consequences of underestimating someone who had been written off too quickly. By the time I reached the street, I felt a mix of emotions: anger, shock, disbelief, but also an unfamiliar clarity. The office behind me represented not opportunity, but a challenge. I had been discarded, yes, but not defeated. Something stronger had emerged from that dismissal: determination. And somewhere deep inside, I knew that this moment, the moment they thought was the end of my journey, was actually the beginning of something far greater. Something that would turn the tables in ways they could never have anticipated. The first night after losing my job, the apartment felt suffocating. The silence was heavy, pressing in on me from all sides, amplifying every thought, every memory of what had just happened. I couldn't sleep, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw the office, the bright lights, the polished floors, the people who had smiled politely but never meant it. I saw my manager's cold, unreadable face and heard the words again: "We're letting you go." Effective immediately, the words echoed like a hammer striking metal, impossible to shake off, impossible to ignore. It wasn't just a sentence, it was a verdict, a dismissal of years of effort, of loyalty, of dedication. I thought about everything I had done for that company: the late nights, the extra hours, the clients I had won over, the problems I had solved that no one else would touch. I thought about the colleagues I had helped, often without thanks or acknowledgement, and the pride I had felt in doing good work, believing it mattered. But none of it mattered. They had thrown me away as if I had been nothing but a tool, a temporary asset that could be replaced without consequence. The realization sank into me like ice in my veins. Betrayal wasn't just a feeling, it was the truth of the world I had been working in. I started pacing the apartment, talking to myself, reliving every detail, questioning every choice. How could years of effort be erased in a single moment? How could loyalty, skill, and competence mean so little to the people who had benefited from them the most? My thoughts spiraled, but then clarity began to emerge through the haze of anger. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't helpless. I wasn't going to sit at home crying or sending desperate emails begging for my old job back. That was what they expected, and I refused to give them that satisfaction. The anger inside me transformed, sharpened, focused. It wasn't blind rage anymore. It became fuel, a tool to channel every ounce of frustration and injustice into a plan. I thought about the clients I had built relationships with, the ones who had confided in me about their frustrations, their dissatisfaction with how they were being treated. I remembered their complaints, the details they had shared, the subtle signs that they felt undervalued and ignored. Every conversation, every problem I had solved for them became a potential step in a larger strategy, a piece of leverage I could use. Patience became my weapon. I knew this wasn't a matter of acting rashly. This wasn't about shouting, confrontation, or chaos. This was about observation, preparation, and precision. I would turn this injustice into opportunity. I would show them that their dismissal of me had been a catastrophic mistake. I began imagining the steps I could take, the actions I could implement quietly, methodically, without revealing myself too soon. Every move had to be calculated, every word deliberate. I didn't need to act immediately. I needed to plan, to think, to prepare for the perfect moment to strike. Not in anger, but in strategy. I replayed their mistakes over and over. The arrogance of assuming loyalty was permanent, that a client's trust could not be transferred, that my absence would go unnoticed. They had assumed that removing me would erase influence, silence competence, and protect their control. They didn't understand one crucial truth: relationships, trust, and skill are portable. They cannot be confined by a title or a company. That revelation settled in me like a burning truth. I had everything I needed to turn the tables. They had underestimated me, and that miscalculation would be their downfall. As the night wore on, my mind became a map of opportunities. I thought about every client, every project, every weak point I had noticed within the company. I considered the gaps they had ignored, the dissatisfaction they had overlooked, the problems they hadn't addressed because they assumed someone else would handle it. Every small insight, every overlooked detail became a stepping stone in a plan that would not only reclaim what I had lost, but surpass it. I began to see a path forward, a sequence of actions that, if executed correctly, could dismantle the facade of control my former employer believed they had. The anger and betrayal I had felt hours before had transformed into something more potent. Focus. I was no longer just reacting emotionally. I was thinking strategically, with precision and clarity. I knew I had to wait for the right moment, approach the right clients, and deliver undeniable value in a way my former company could never anticipate. This wasn't about revenge for revenge's sake. It was about justice, about demonstrating that talent and loyalty cannot be discarded without consequence. Every detail mattered. Every client interaction was a potential lever, and every step had to be calculated. By the time dawn crept into the room, I felt a mixture of exhaustion, exhilaration, and determination. I realized that being fired was not the end. It was the beginning of something much bigger. The dismissal had ignited a fire within me, a burning clarity that had been absent when I was blindly dedicated to loyalty that wasn't reciprocated. I would turn betrayal into strategy, anger into action, and loss into opportunity. They thought they could remove me without consequence. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. That night, alone, sleepless, and filled with the heat of injustice, I made a promise to myself. I would not be powerless. I would not let their short-sightedness define my career or my worth. I would use every skill, every insight, every relationship I had built to transform the situation in my favor. The first step had already been taken. I had survived their betrayal. Now it was time to turn it into opportunity, and I knew with absolute certainty that the story was just beginning. The morning after I had made my plans, I moved quietly, deliberately, like a shadow moving through familiar territory. I didn't rush. I didn't announce myself. I simply observed. I watched the office from a distance, noticing everything I had overlooked before. The subtle tension in the air, the way managers carried themselves with false confidence, the subtle frustrations on employees' faces, and the clients who were beginning to show cracks in their loyalty. Every detail was a thread I could pull, every weakness a point I could exploit. I had learned that revenge wasn't about aggression or chaos. It was about patience, about choosing the right moment and executing with precision. Acting too soon would be foolish. Acting too late would be wasteful, but the right timing would make the impact undeniable. Clients were my focus. They were the true lifeblood of the company, the reason it functioned, and the reason it had grown in the first place. And I knew them better than anyone else. I remembered which clients were quietly dissatisfied, which ones felt neglected, and which ones were already considering leaving. I recalled the subtle complaints they had shared with me in passing, the frustrations they had voiced under their breath, the small details that hinted at unmet expectations. Every interaction I had had with them became a potential lever, a point of connection I could use to draw them closer. I didn't need to manipulate or trick them. I just needed to be attentive where my former company had been indifferent. Care, focus, and genuine attention would be enough. I began organizing everything carefully. Names, priorities, problems, gaps in service, opportunities, each piece catalogued and considered. I even remembered personal details, small things clients had mentioned that had seemed insignificant at the time. A birthday, a preferred communication style, a comment about how slow responses made them feel undervalued. Those little details, seemingly trivial, were the invisible threads of loyalty, and I intended to use them. I didn't want chaos. I wanted precision. Each interaction, each email, each conversation had to serve a purpose, a strategic step toward the ultimate goal of demonstrating value where my former company had failed. As I observed the office, I began to see patterns I hadn't noticed before. Managers were overconfident, certain that client loyalty was guaranteed. Employees were complacent, assuming the company's name alone would carry weight. And yet, underneath that surface, the cracks were there. Miscommunications, slow responses, unmet promises, overlooked opportunities. Every flaw was a doorway, every ignored client a chance to demonstrate that things could be done better. I began visualizing the sequence of actions I would take, the timing of each message, each meeting, each outreach. I wasn't working blindly. I was building a map of influence, and every move was carefully considered. Patience became my greatest strength. The instinct to rush, to act immediately out of anger or frustration, had to be resisted. True strategy required observation, planning, and timing. I imagined the reactions of my former colleagues, how they would scramble when clients began asking questions, raising concerns, or shifting loyalty. I imagined the slow realization that the company had overlooked something vital, and that the person they had dismissed was the one now quietly proving their value. That vision of eventual triumph, carefully executed, became a quiet fuel, warming the fire of my determination. Every client I thought of, every interaction I had had in the past, became a point of leverage. I remembered who had expressed doubts about responsiveness, who had been dissatisfied with service, who had felt invisible to the company. Each detail became a potential conversation, a chance to reconnect, to show attentiveness, to provide solutions that my former company had failed to offer. I did not need to boast or exaggerate. I only needed to act where others had failed. In this, patience and precision were my allies. Acting hastily would ruin the plan. Waiting for the right moment would make the impact unavoidable. As the day progressed, I refined my strategy in my mind. I considered every step, anticipating responses, predicting objections, and preparing solutions in advance. I thought about how to approach each client individually, how to rebuild trust, how to offer reassurance and value that could not be ignored. I considered the ways the company had failed, the gaps they had overlooked, and the opportunities that had been left open. Every small piece of insight was stored carefully, like pieces of a puzzle waiting to be assembled into a complete picture. The office itself was a study in complacency, and I knew it would be easy to exploit if I moved correctly. Managers assumed control, employees assumed stability, and clients assumed loyalty. But all of those assumptions were fragile, and all of them depended on continued neglect of the details that really mattered. I saw that clearly now. I didn't need to create chaos. I simply needed to act strategically, consistently, and with focus. Every message, every interaction, every solution I offered to clients would gradually demonstrate my presence and value, all while keeping my identity discreet and untraceable at first. By nightfall, my plan had taken shape. I had a list of clients, a schedule of potential outreach, a set of small advantages to exploit, and a methodical approach to building influence where it had been neglected. I didn't need to rush, I didn't need to force the outcome, and I didn't need to act with blind emotion. The seeds of revenge had been planted, carefully and deliberately, nurtured with patience and precision. Every move from this point forward would build momentum, demonstrating value, winning trust, and slowly undermining the false security my former company had relied on. I went to bed that night with a sense of purpose I'd never felt before. The anger and frustration that had burned so hotly the day I was fired had transformed into focus and determination. The strategy was clear. The tools were at my disposal, and the clients who had once trusted me were now points of leverage that could not be ignored. I didn't need confrontation or drama. I simply needed time, precision, and persistence. Revenge wasn't about emotion anymore. It was about execution, and the foundation had been laid. The seeds had been planted, and when the moment came, they would grow into something undeniable, unstoppable, and inevitable. The first messages I sent were simple, almost casual, but carefully calculated. I didn't want to alarm anyone or appear desperate. I wanted to offer something tangible, something that directly addressed the pain points I already knew existed. I can help you with your current challenges. Interested? That was all. The simplicity of the line disguised the weight of what it represented. I wasn't asking for permission to prove myself. I was presenting a solution that only I could deliver. I expected hesitation, even polite rejection, perhaps skepticism from clients who had grown accustomed to broken promises. I braced for silence, imagining the polite declines that might confirm my fears. But the responses surprised me. They came, back slowly at first, one or two, then more as the day wore on. The tones varied. Some were hesitant, cautious, curious. Others carried relief, a sigh that seemed almost audible through the text, a recognition that someone was finally paying attention to the problems they had voiced and been ignored for months. A few were sharper, tinged with frustration, barely contained anger at the neglect they had endured. Reading those words, I felt a rush, not of triumph, but of clarity. These were the same clients I had spent months nurturing, understanding, and helping. They had been waiting for someone to see what they had been missing, and now, without fanfare, I was that someone. I didn't boast or brag. I didn't remind them of the failures they had endured or my own dismissal. There was no need for theatrics. Instead, I delivered solutions, immediate, practical, and effective. I addressed stalled projects, answered questions that had gone unanswered for weeks, and solved problems that no one else in my former company had wanted to touch. I moved, quickly, anticipating needs before they were even fully articulated. Every response I sent, every action I took, was designed to show that competence, reliability, and attention were still within reach, just outside the grasp of the company that had dismissed me so thoughtlessly. Clients noticed the difference immediately. Where there had once been delays, now there was speed. Where there had been ambiguity, now there was clarity. Where there had been frustration and indifference, now there was focus and care. Emails were returned promptly, solutions were executed efficiently, and the smallest details were remembered, details that had previously been overlooked or dismissed. Slowly, trust began to rebuild itself around my presence. It was subtle at first, a cautious optimism, a tentative recognition that someone actually cared. Then it grew, spreading as clients saw consistency in every interaction, reliability in every action, and a pattern of responsiveness they hadn't experienced in months, sometimes years. Meanwhile, my former company remained oblivious. They assumed the clients would stay because they had always stayed before, because contracts and policies gave the illusion of loyalty. They had no idea that loyalty is not guaranteed, that it is fragile, and that it can shift silently when attention and care are applied where it had been missing. I observed quietly as the cracks began to form. Clients started asking more questions, expressing concerns, requesting adjustments, and seeking clarification in ways that signaled dissatisfaction with the status quo. The responses they received were slow, detached, and lacking the human touch they needed. My presence, calm and deliberate, became the contrast that exposed those deficiencies. I didn't rush or overextend myself. Every client I approached was treated individually, with solutions tailored to their specific needs. I remembered what they had shared in the past, the frustrations and the hopes, and I used that knowledge to guide my actions. Each interaction was precise, calculated, and meaningful. There was no need for theatrics. The work spoke for itself, and as the work succeeded, the influence grew, quietly, imperceptibly at first, then more noticeably. Contracts that had seemed stable began to wobble. Conversations about renewal turned tentative, and the security my former company had assumed began to unravel. It was a slow, methodical process, and I savored it. I wasn't seeking immediate revenge. I was constructing a network of trust, a web of influence, a silent demonstration that competence and loyalty could not be discarded without consequence. Clients were responding because I was present where they had been neglected, because I provided clarity and reliability, and because I treated them as human beings rather than as mere numbers. That realization, that attention and action outweighed formal agreements and office hierarchies, became my most powerful insight. I was winning, quietly and relentlessly, and there was no need for confrontation or chaos. As days turned into weeks, the results multiplied. One client would send an email mentioning relief at finally seeing progress. Another would ask for a meeting to discuss expansion or new opportunities. Patterns emerged. Clients preferred working with someone who listened, who acted, who remembered their priorities. My former company, unaware of the shift, remained confident, assuming inertia would preserve loyalty. They were wrong. Each step I took, each problem I solved, each client interaction added to a growing momentum they could not perceive until it was too late. By the end of the month, the landscape had changed. Contracts once thought secure now had cracks, and clients were weighing options they hadn't considered before. I had done nothing dramatic, no public statements, no aggressive campaigns. Everything I achieved was the result of consistent competence, deliberate strategy, and careful attention to details others had ignored. Loyalty had been earned, quietly but irreversibly, through actions, not words. I had taken control not through confrontation but through performance, and the results spoke louder than any declaration could. In those weeks, I realized the truth of power and influence. It isn't gained by titles, it isn't guaranteed by contracts, and it isn't secured by complacency. It is earned, slowly, deliberately, and persistently. By being reliable, attentive, and proactive, I reclaimed more than just client trust. I reclaimed my professional presence, my leverage, and the undeniable proof that underestimating me had been a critical mistake. Each success was a silent but powerful message. Loyalty is not bought or assumed, it is earned, and I was earning it relentlessly. It didn't take long for the cracks to appear. At first, it was subtle, almost imperceptible. A hesitant email from a client expressing doubts, a question about timelines that had never been asked before, a request for guidance on what had once seemed routine. These small signals told me everything I needed to know. The relationships I had cultivated, the attentiveness I had offered, were beginning to pull clients away from the company that had discarded me so carelessly. Some reached out cautiously, asking if I could help without disrupting internal politics. Others were more direct, acknowledging frustrations they could no longer ignore. Every message confirmed that my plan was working, that the careful observation, patience, and strategy I had developed were paying off. From a distance, I watched the office I had once called my own begin to unravel. The changes were subtle at first. Hurried meetings, brief exchanges in hallways, conversations that seemed more tense than necessary. Then the ripple effect grew. Managers began whispering, trying to piece together why clients were dissatisfied or leaving. Staff members became defensive, questioning every decision and second-guessing each other in ways that hadn't existed before. The atmosphere, once steady and predictable, shifted into something brittle and toxic. Anxiety and fear replaced confidence, and the once controlled environment became a chaotic scramble to maintain appearances. The best part was that they had no idea what was happening. To them, it felt like a slow leak in an empire they believed was unassailable. Clients began to question the company's competence quietly, without announcing their dissatisfaction to the wider team. Internal panic spread because management saw symptoms but couldn't find the source. They assumed the problems were random, that miscommunication or bad luck were to blame, never suspecting the careful, deliberate strategy unfolding quietly behind the scenes. I watched it all with a steady sense of satisfaction, knowing that their scramble was the natural consequence of underestimating relationships and human trust. I received messages from clients that revealed their growing frustration with the company. "We need someone who actually listens," one wrote. "I can't wait any longer for them to respond," said another. These weren't pleas for revenge or dramatics. They were requests for consistency, for reliability, for attention that had long been absent. I responded promptly, offering solutions, following through, and keeping every promise I made. Every small act of attention created a ripple, building trust while exposing the company's negligence. With each action, I was demonstrating the stark contrast between their approach and mine, showing that competence and attentiveness mattered far more than titles or assumed loyalty. Inside the company, the panic intensified. Managers called emergency meetings, staff reassigned tasks haphazardly, and internal memos flew back and forth as teams scrambled to cover gaps that had been ignored for months. Every reaction seemed desperate, reactive rather than proactive, and it only made the internal chaos more visible. People began blaming each other, miscommunication increased, and small errors that had been tolerable before were now treated as crises. The office was still functional on the surface, but underneath, confidence had fractured, and the veneer of control was cracking. I had no desire to escalate unnecessarily. I wasn't sending threats or public complaints. I didn't need to. The strategy worked because I provided what the company had failed to give: attention, solutions, and reliability. Clients who had once been frustrated and overlooked now had someone they could count on. They were beginning to act quietly, shifting accounts, reallocating projects, and consulting me for guidance on decisions they had once deferred to the company. Every small move strengthened my position while amplifying the stress and uncertainty inside the office. What fascinated me most was the contrast. My actions were calm, deliberate, and consistent, whereas the company's reactions were erratic and panicked. Where I had offered clarity, they offered confusion. Where I had built trust, they tried to patch relationships with hastily constructed apologies and half measures. The disparity became more apparent with every passing day. Clients noticed it too. They began commenting, often indirectly, on the difference in responsiveness and care. Their recognition, small as it might have seemed, was the kind of leverage that cannot be manufactured. It is earned through consistent action over time. I observed as internal dynamics deteriorated further. Managers who had once been confident now questioned every move, scrutinized reports with paranoia, and demanded explanations that were impossible to provide. Staff members became guarded, hesitant to act without approval, fearful of making mistakes. The office's energy shifted from one of productivity to one of constant vigilance, a state of chronic anxiety that made even minor tasks feel significant. Meanwhile, I continued quietly, steadily, consistently providing what was needed, demonstrating the value of reliability in a way that contrasted sharply with the internal chaos I watched unfold. Clients began to take subtle but meaningful steps, guided by my actions. Some requested meetings to discuss long-term plans. Others asked for advice on restructuring projects or prioritizing deliverables. Each request was a signal that the relationship they once had with the company was weakening, and that my presence had become a trusted alternative. I didn't need to exaggerate or force a decision. The company's failure to maintain trust and provide consistent care had already set the stage. My role was simply to be reliable and present, filling the gaps they had ignored. By the end of the month, the cumulative effect was undeniable. The panic in the office had grown to a point where every misstep was magnified, every missed deadline questioned, and every client interaction scrutinized. Managers were exhausted, staff was defensive, and the culture that had once seemed stable was unraveling. Meanwhile, the clients I had quietly helped were gaining confidence, making decisions, and building a renewed trust that had no connection to the bureaucracy they had left behind. My strategy had worked. The company's instability was visible, but they didn't know why. The leak had gone unnoticed until the results were already in motion. It was almost poetic in its precision. I didn't need to confront anyone directly. I didn't need to issue threats or reveal my plan. All that was required was consistency, attentiveness, and timing. The panic they experienced was the natural outcome of neglect, exposed through a quiet but deliberate demonstration of competence and reliability. I watched, calm and detached, as the office I had once been part of flailed, realizing that their assumption of control had been an illusion all along. My work was done quietly, steadily, and with precision, and the consequences were undeniable. The lessons were clear. Influence and trust cannot be mandated. They are earned through repeated, consistent actions. Neglect these fundamentals, and even the largest organizations are vulnerable to collapse, not in structure, but in relationships and confidence. I had engineered this quietly, deliberately, and without drama, and the panic that spread throughout the office was proof that strategy and execution outweigh arrogance and assumed authority every time. Watching them scramble, trying to regain a grip they had never truly held, brought the knowledge that justice, when applied thoughtfully and methodically, leaves no ambiguity. The turning point came quietly, almost imperceptibly at first, yet it changed everything. It wasn't one of the smaller clients, nor the ones who were content to remain out of convenience. It was one of the biggest accounts the company had, the kind that everyone assumed would never leave. I knew this client inside and out. Their frustrations, their unspoken expectations, the gaps in service that had slowly piled up over years. They had stayed not because of loyalty, but because moving seemed inconvenient, messy, or unnecessary. They had tolerated delays, miscommunications, and broken promises simply because no one had made them feel otherwise. I knew that if I could reach them, if I could show them someone actually cared, The ripple effect would be undeniable. I approached them carefully, not as an angry ex-employee or a competitor, but as a problem solver. My messages were deliberate, thoughtful, and completely focused on their needs. I outlined a plan to address each of the lingering issues, one by one, detailing the improvements they had been promised and never received. I proposed solutions that were actionable, timelines that were realistic, and a level of attention that showed I remembered every detail they had ever shared. I wasn't trying to impress them with flair or dramatics. I wanted them to feel understood and to know that finally someone was listening. Their concerns, frustrations, and previous disappointments would be met with concrete action, not empty assurances. The response came faster than I expected. Meetings were scheduled within days, and during each one, I presented ideas, answers, and strategies to fix the problems that had plagued them for months. I didn't dwell on my previous dismissal or the failures of the company that had let them down. Instead, I focused on solutions, efficiency, and trust. Each answer was clear and precise. Every suggestion was backed by practical steps. I showed them that I was reliable, that follow-through was not a promise, but a guarantee. By the end of the first week, they were not just impressed, they were relieved. They signed with me, the first major client to move decisively, setting the stage for what was to come. Once that contract was secured, the momentum built naturally. Other clients began to notice, either through quiet conversation or subtle differences in the level of responsiveness they received when engaging with me. Where the company had once been their default, trusted by inertia alone, I became the more compelling option. Slowly, clients started asking for guidance, looking for solutions, and exploring new possibilities they had never considered under the previous management. Contracts that had been assumed secure suddenly became fluid. Each new client that reached out added to the momentum, and the influence I had cultivated began to grow exponentially. This wasn't just about taking clients. It was about exposing weaknesses. Each client that left, each contract that shifted, was a reflection of systemic failures inside the company. Leadership had assumed that loyalty could be taken for granted, that relationships could be replaced with policies, and that results could be ignored without consequence. They had underestimated the power of attention, responsiveness, and trust. I wasn't merely reclaiming what had been lost. I was demonstrating in the most undeniable way what happens when you treat competence and loyalty as disposable. The company remained unaware at first. They assumed that everything was fine, that contracts were stable, that their authority and structure would protect them. They were wrong. Internal meetings became frantic as leadership tried to understand the sudden unrest among clients. Managers called emergency sessions, staff were reassigned hastily, and directives flew in all directions as the organization attempted to regain control. Each misstep, each frantic reaction, only highlighted their failures. While they scrambled to patch the leaks they couldn't see, I continued quietly, methodically, delivering results and building trust. The contrast between their chaos and my calm effectiveness was undeniable. Clients began to take subtle, deliberate steps. Some requested longer-term consultations, others explored options for expanding our work together, and a few even sought advice on restructuring projects. Each action was a signal that their loyalty to the company was no longer automatic, that they had found someone who could fulfill their expectations consistently. I didn't need to push or convince. The evidence of competence and reliability spoke for itself. My presence provided clarity where there had once been frustration, and over time, the client's confidence shifted from their old provider to me. The psychological impact on the company was profound. Managers who had once been confident and decisive became hesitant, second-guessing every decision. Staff grew defensive, fearful of making errors that could be blamed on them. The office culture, once stable and predictable, became reactive, anxious, and tense. They could feel the shift but couldn't identify the source. They saw symptoms but not the strategy behind them. Meanwhile, my approach remained consistent. Focus on results, respond promptly, anticipate needs, and maintain a steady presence. The momentum continued to build quietly, irreversibly. The significance of this turning point was clear. It was no longer just about a single client or a single success. It was a demonstration of how competence, attentiveness, and trust create momentum that cannot be easily reversed. The company's reliance on hierarchy, assumed loyalty, and bureaucratic control had been its undoing. The client's migration was not caused by dramatic confrontations or threats. It was caused by a lack of care, a gap in attention, and the presence of someone who understood how to fill it. Every new client who moved decisively reinforced the lesson. Actions matter more than titles. Reliability outweighs promises, and neglected relationships will always seek restoration when given the opportunity. By the end of the month, the shift was undeniable. Contracts that had been considered untouchable were now at risk. Clients had found a provider who listened, who acted, and who delivered consistently. The company's assumed control had eroded to the point where every lost contract, every hesitant conversation, and every frustrated client became a reflection of systemic neglect. I remained calm, steady, and precise throughout, knowing that the turning point was not a single moment, but a wave of momentum that, once set in motion, could not be stopped. This was the culmination of careful planning, patience, and relentless focus. The turning point proved that influence is not about status, office politics, or perceived authority. It is earned through consistency, attention, and competence. By identifying the critical client, approaching them with a thoughtful strategy, and executing flawlessly, I had initiated a chain reaction that exposed weaknesses, reclaimed value, and demonstrated the consequences of undervaluing talent and relationships. The company had been blind to the human element they dismissed, and the results spoke louder than any internal report ever could. The momentum that followed that first major client continued to grow. Others followed, contracts shifted, and the company, now aware of the change but still unable to fully comprehend it, scrambled in vain to regain footing. Each success reinforced the principle that reliability, care, and responsiveness are far more powerful than assumed authority. I had turned a single opportunity into a decisive advantage, proving that strategic action, executed with precision and patience, could alter outcomes in ways that reactionary measures never could. The impact of everything that had unfolded settled over me in a way I hadn't anticipated. At first, it was almost surreal to watch the consequences of my careful strategy ripple outward. I had always known that the company's negligence would have repercussions, that their dismissal of loyalty, effort, and competence would eventually backfire. But seeing it all manifest, the panic in meetings, the hurried emails, the subtle chaos of their office culture, was an emotional experience I couldn't have fully imagined. It wasn't gloating or petty satisfaction that filled me. It was something deeper, more complex. It was the quiet recognition that justice had been restored in a system that had treated me as disposable. I had been underestimated, disregarded, and dismissed. And now the scales were balancing not through brute force, but through precision, patience, and competence. Late at night, I would sit alone and replay the events in my mind. I thought about every client I had reached out to, every solution I had proposed, every small action that had collectively led to their shift in trust. It wasn't about me manipulating outcomes or forcing anyone's hand. It was about providing what had been missing, filling gaps that were neglected, and letting the natural consequences of negligence unfold. Each client who chose to work with me did so willingly, driven by dissatisfaction that had been ignored for months or years. Their decisions were their own, and that autonomy made the impact feel fair and just, not cruel. I realized then that true satisfaction comes not from revenge, but from the quiet certainty of having acted correctly, deliberately, and ethically, while others failed to recognize their own errors. There were moments when friends or family asked if I felt any guilt, if perhaps I had gone too far in taking clients from the company that had once employed me. I would tell them no. Every move I made was justified. Every action I had taken had been fair and transparent within the bounds of professional responsibility. I hadn't coerced anyone, hadn't manipulated circumstances unfairly, and hadn't crossed ethical lines. The unfairness had started long before I intervened. It had started the moment they dismissed loyalty and effort as irrelevant, the moment they treated a committed employee as disposable. I hadn't created the imbalance. I had merely corrected it. In that correction, I found not only satisfaction, but clarity and closure. The emotional impact was not confined to satisfaction alone. It was also about reclaiming control over my own life. Losing that job had been a shock, a deep wound that left me questioning my worth, my choices, and my direction. But in the process of turning betrayal into opportunity, I discovered a profound sense of agency. I realized that I could navigate adversity not by reacting impulsively, but by acting strategically, patiently, and deliberately. I could create outcomes that reflected my competence and integrity rather than letting circumstance dictate my path. Every client I guided, every contract that transitioned under my influence, reinforced the understanding that my value was not defined by others' acknowledgement, but by the results I could deliver and the trust I could build. There was also a surprising sense of relief that accompanied this pride. For months, perhaps even years, I had carried a quiet anxiety, the fear that my efforts would be overlooked, that my dedication would go unnoticed, that my work would never matter beyond superficial acknowledgement. That anxiety had been rooted in the dismissal itself, in the abrupt and unexplained termination that had made me feel disposable. But as the consequences of that dismissal unfolded, as clients shifted loyalties and recognized the value I offered, the relief was profound. I had turned a situation that could have left me powerless into one where I controlled outcomes, rebuilt trust, and demonstrated competence. The anxiety faded, replaced by a sense of accomplishment that was quietly but deeply fulfilling. Reflecting further, I realized that the emotional impact extended beyond the professional sphere. It touched my sense of self, my confidence, and my understanding of resilience. Betrayal, as painful as it can become a catalyst for growth when met with clarity and purpose. Anger need not lead to reckless action. It can drive focused, intelligent strategy. Injustice need not leave scars of resentment. It can be transformed into an opportunity to demonstrate skill, integrity, and capability. I had been wronged, yes, but in the careful, measured steps I took, I had reclaimed more than clients or contracts. I had reclaimed my own power, my self-respect, and my ability to act decisively in the face of adversity. Even during quiet moments, when the office was dark and the world outside still, I would reflect on the chain of events. I remembered the initial dismissal, the careful planning, the silent observation, and the methodical execution that had led to this moment. I visualized the office in disarray, managers scrambling, staff second-guessing, and the panic spreading without any visible origin. That panic was not the goal, but it was an inevitable byproduct of neglected responsibility and arrogance. What mattered most was the clarity I had achieved. Clarity for myself, clarity for the clients, and the restoration of equilibrium that had been disrupted by their negligence. The emotional impact was also deeply personal. I had transformed vulnerability into strength. The fear and uncertainty that came with losing a job, of being discarded without explanation, had been intense, but I had converted that energy into focused action. Every client who transitioned willingly, every successful solution I provided, was a testament to the power of deliberate choice over circumstance. I realized that dignity cannot be stolen. It is taken, maintained, and reinforced through action. My victories were not the result of chaos or confrontation, but of competence, patience, and unwavering integrity. In the end, the emotional impact was a combination of pride, relief, and a sense of justice. I had not acted impulsively, nor had I sought to humiliate anyone. I had responded to unfairness with precision and fairness, converting betrayal into opportunity and neglect into recognition. The company's panic was a natural consequence of their own actions, not my provocation. I had acted ethically, strategically, and decisively, and the results were undeniable. I had reclaimed control of my life, restored my dignity, and created outcomes that reflected my abilities and values. The satisfaction I felt was deep and lasting because it was rooted not in revenge, but in justice, fairness, and the knowledge that I had acted correctly in the face of adversity. Looking back, the emotional impact also included a profound lesson. We are defined not by the injustices we endure, but by how we respond to them. I had been underestimated, ignored, and discarded. But I had turned that experience into a demonstration of skill, patience, and integrity. Each step I took reinforced my confidence and resilience. Each client's trust affirmed the value of deliberate action, and each outcome reminded me that justice, when pursued through competence and fairness, leaves no ambiguity. The turning of betrayal into opportunity had not only shifted professional dynamics, but had also transformed my understanding of my own strength and capacity to act decisively. Looking back on everything that had happened, the lessons became clearer and more profound than I could have realized at the time. The first lesson was about trust, but not in the naive sense I had practiced before. Trust is valuable, but it must be given wisely. In my earlier years, I had believed that loyalty, dedication, and hard work would automatically earn respect and recognition. I had trusted colleagues and managers without question, assuming that their actions would reflect the same principles that guided me. That assumption had been my first mistake. Not everyone operates on the same values. Not everyone sees effort as meaningful. And not everyone reciprocates dedication. This realization, painful as it was, became the foundation of everything I did afterward. I learned to observe carefully, to understand intentions before committing energy, and to protect my own value by being deliberate about who I trusted. The second lesson was about valuing myself. It took losing my job in such a sudden and dismissive way to recognize that my worth had never depended on their acknowledgement. I had spent years pouring my energy into work, helping others succeed, and expecting that my contributions would naturally lead to recognition. Instead, I had been discarded without explanation, a reminder that external validation is fragile and unreliable. Every skill I had honed, every relationship I had nurtured, and every challenge I had solved was part of my inherent value, and it was up to me to honor that value, regardless of how others treated me. That realization changed the way I approached every decision after being let go. I understood that valuing myself meant acting decisively, leveraging my skills, and trusting that competence and integrity are worth more than empty praise or assumed loyalty. Patience and strategy became the third vital lesson. Anger is a natural human reaction when wronged, but acting on it impulsively rarely produces meaningful results. My victories were not the result of rash decisions or emotional retaliation. They were the outcome of careful observation, deliberate planning, and strategic execution. I studied clients' needs, identified the weaknesses in my former company, and waited for the right moments to act. Patience allowed me to understand the full scope of the situation and prepare for every eventuality, while strategy ensured that every action was deliberate and effective. The combination of patience and calculated planning proved far more powerful than any immediate, impulsive response could have been. It was a lesson in restraint, foresight, and the quiet but decisive power of measured action. Another important lesson was that true influence does not require destruction or deception. I did not lie, manipulate, or sabotage anyone. I simply provided value where it had been missing and allowed natural consequences to unfold. Clients chose to work with me because they recognized attention, reliability, and competence, not because I forced the issue. True power, I realized, comes from acting with integrity, providing undeniable value, and letting outcomes demonstrate your worth. Chaos, confrontation, or aggression can create temporary satisfaction, but sustainable results come from deliberate, principled action. I had achieved more by building trust and solving problems than any act of petty revenge could have accomplished. Perspective was another crucial lesson. I could have allowed the betrayal and dismissal to define me, to fill me with bitterness or resentment. Instead, I chose to see it as an opportunity to observe, learn, and act strategically. Anger became motivation, frustration became insight, and loss became leverage. Life often presents situations where others try to diminish or dismiss you, but the measure of strength is in the response. Choosing to respond thoughtfully, deliberately, and ethically ensures that the results are meaningful and long-lasting. The setbacks I faced became tools for growth, not anchors of regret. I learned that the way we interpret and react to adversity determines not just outcomes, but our own character. A key lesson was also understanding the inherent value of loyalty and skill. People who disregard effort, competence, and dedication may believe they are in control, but consequences are inevitable. By acting strategically and demonstrating value, I had not only reclaimed what was rightfully mine, but also highlighted the cost of underestimating talent and loyalty. The company's failures were revealed not through confrontation, but through the natural migration of clients seeking someone who would honor their needs. Loyalty and skill are not just abstract concepts. They are forces that, when ignored, create consequences that cannot be avoided. I had simply allowed these forces to manifest naturally, guided by competence and fairness rather than malice. Self-awareness and integrity also emerged as essential lessons. Responding to betrayal or injustice with intelligence and composure teaches resilience and reinforces confidence. Every client I gained, every project I completed successfully, was a reflection not only of my professional abilities, but also of my capacity to navigate adversity without compromising ethics. I understood that my actions could achieve results while maintaining personal integrity, and that lesson carried weight far beyond immediate professional outcomes. The story became a guide for future decisions, showing that principled action, combined with patience and strategy, produces outcomes that are both effective and honorable. Reflection revealed one final lesson. Setbacks and betrayal are not the end. They are opportunities to grow, demonstrate competence, and establish personal and professional authority. What initially felt like a devastating loss became a powerful catalyst for transformation. Every step I took was guided by deliberate thought, careful planning, and a focus on fairness. In doing so, I reclaimed control over my life, restored my dignity, and created outcomes that reflected skill, intelligence, and integrity. The true lesson is that adversity, when met with clarity, patience, and ethical action, becomes a teacher rather than a tormentor. Ultimately, the story teaches that calculated action, grounded in fairness and competence, is far more impactful than impulsive retaliation. Trust wisely, value yourself, act strategically, and let skill and integrity guide outcomes. Betrayal and setbacks are inevitable in life, but how we respond defines us more than the injustices themselves. By internalizing these lessons, I transformed a negative experience into a source of empowerment, resilience, and clarity, demonstrating that justice, opportunity, and personal growth often emerge quietly from deliberate, principled action. The final client signing marked more than just a business victory. It marked the end of a long, complex journey that had begun with betrayal and uncertainty. Sitting back and watching that final contract come through, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The office I had once been a part of, the place that had dismissed me without explanation, finally began to realize the gap I had filled, the expertise and dedication they had taken for granted. They noticed the clients leaving, the projects being executed seamlessly elsewhere, and the steady, quiet influence I had rebuilt outside their walls. Yet I didn't feel any urge to return. That chapter had closed, and my focus was entirely on the life and career I had carved for myself. One defined by respect, recognition, and a system where my efforts were valued, not dismissed. Watching the recognition unfold from a distance was satisfying, but it was the independence, the self-determination, and the knowledge that I was no longer dependent on their approval that truly mattered. Being fired had felt like an abrupt ending, a sudden rupture in the life I had been building with care and dedication. It was painful, confusing, and disorienting. But now, looking back, I could see that it was not truly an ending at all. Endings are rarely what they seem. They are opportunities in disguise, chances to reset, rebuild, and reclaim control. That dismissal, which at the time had felt like an irrevocable loss, had actually been the catalyst that forced me to act, to innovate, and to assert my own value in ways I might never have explored if I had remained complacent. Betrayal, hurt, or injustice is often perceived as a defining moment of weakness, but in truth, it is the response that defines us. The choices we make in the aftermath, the patience we exercise, and the strategy we employ shape our trajectory far more than the initial act of wrongdoing ever could. I had chosen clarity, precision, and purpose, and that choice had made all the difference. I didn't act out of anger or hatred. Every move I made was rooted in determination, intelligence, and a refusal to allow anyone to underestimate me again. I reclaimed what was mine, not through malice, but through deliberate, fair, and strategic action. Every client who transitioned to work with me did so willingly, recognizing value that had been overlooked by others. I had built a system that relied on competence, attention, and integrity, rather than manipulation or deceit. In doing so, I didn't just recover what had been taken, I demonstrated that fairness, skill, and dedication have their own power and influence. The process required patience, careful observation, and strategic timing. Every step had to be measured, precise, and thoughtful, ensuring that the outcomes were both effective and just. The satisfaction I felt was profound, but it wasn't rooted in the downfall of others. It was rooted in the restoration of my own agency. I had regained control over my career, my reputation, and my life. I had demonstrated that talent and dedication cannot be ignored indefinitely without consequence. Observing the office scramble to understand the gaps I had filled was a reminder that actions, or inactions, have repercussions, but my focus was always on building something sustainable, principled, and rewarding for myself rather than simply punishing anyone else. Independence, integrity, and the ability to act decisively in the face of betrayal became the true measure of success. Every client I gained, every project I executed flawlessly, reinforced my confidence and validated my approach. I didn't need drama or confrontation. The outcomes themselves were proof enough. By the time the last client signed, the full picture was complete. I had rebuilt my professional identity on my own terms, creating a space where my efforts were appreciated and my skills recognized. The company I left behind experienced the effects of neglect and underestimation, but I had moved beyond it, operating in a domain defined by my own standards and values. That contrast was instructive. I had created a foundation that was solid and rewarding, while their panic and scramble highlighted the consequences of dismissing loyalty and competence. Victory, I realized, is never measured by causing pain or humiliation to those who wronged you. True victory comes from reclaiming your own power, restoring your dignity, and building results that reflect your abilities, intelligence, and integrity. My clients were happy, my professional reputation was stronger than ever, and my confidence was unshakable. I had not merely survived the dismissal, I had transformed it into a platform for growth, empowerment, and self-reclamation. Every lesson I had learned about patience, strategy, self-worth, and integrity culminated in this moment of closure. I had converted a painful setback into a series of accomplishments that reaffirmed my competence and vision. Being unstoppable doesn't come from aggression, retaliation, or the desire to inflict harm. It comes from preparation, clarity, and resilience. By the time the final client signed, I had become someone fundamentally different from the person who had first walked into that office with hope and naivety. I had developed a confidence rooted not in external validation, but in demonstrated skill, strategic thinking, and unwavering integrity. My professional identity was no longer dependent on one company, one manager, or one set of colleagues. It was robust, independent, and sustainable. The sense of closure extended beyond the professional domain. There was emotional and psychological closure as well. The quiet satisfaction of having acted with fairness, thoughtfulness, and intelligence. There had been no unnecessary drama, no rash acts, no unethical maneuvering. Just deliberate, principled action that led to undeniable results. The journey from betrayal to triumph became a testament to the power of strategy, patience, and integrity. Each client transition, each successful outcome, each acknowledgement of my value reinforced that principle. I had reclaimed control over my life and career, and the sense of empowerment was absolute. Reflecting further, I recognized that life often delivers challenges, setbacks, and betrayals not to punish but to teach. Being dismissed or undermined is rarely a reflection of your inherent worth. It is an opportunity to test resilience, judgment, and patience. Every adversity contains the seed of growth if approached with clarity and purpose. I had embraced those lessons, applied them strategically, and emerged not just successful, but fundamentally transformed. The initial pain became the driving force behind the reclamation of control, self-respect, and opportunity. In the end, the victory was defined not by the downfall of others, but by the creation of something enduring, principled, and empowering. My clients were satisfied because they were treated with care, respect, and competence. My reputation was strengthened because I acted consistently and ethically. My confidence became unshakable because I had proven to myself that I could navigate adversity successfully, thoughtfully, and strategically. I wasn't merely back on my feet, I had become unstoppable. The chapter of betrayal had closed, but the story continued, now written on my own terms, guided by experience, resilience, and the clarity that comes from turning setback into empowerment. The sense of reflection and closure was complete. Every decision, every measured action, every outcome reinforced the truth that adversity, when met with patience, strategy, and integrity, transforms from a source of pain into a platform for growth. I had taken control, reclaimed what was mine, and built a life and career defined by principle, competence, and unshakable confidence. In that realization, I understood that victory is not about revenge. It is about creating, sustaining, and thriving in a life where your value cannot be denied, underestimated, or dismissed again.